Morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the second annual Global Climate Action Symposium. My name is Kim Cobb, professor in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech and the director of Georgia Tech's Global Change Program. Together with our partners, Georgia Tech's Center for Serve, Learn, Sustain, the Atlantic Global Studies Center, as well as Atlanta-based consulates of Germany, France, Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, and the UK, we are thrilled to welcome you to this exciting event today focused on environmental and climate justice. This, as you know, is an incredibly important and timely conversation, and I think as Hurricane Delta bears down on vulnerable communities in the Yucatan Peninsula right now before taking aim at the battered Louisiana coastline that was hit by Hurricane Laura earlier this year, we can understand just how overdue this conversation is. Not just here in our area in Atlanta, where we have some acute environmental and climate justice issues we will hear about today, but across this nation and, of course, across the world, where some of these challenges are particularly also acute. And so I'm very pleased to be centering our event this week around this theme today, because we have brought together such an amazing set of experts to bring testimony to this, to help us engage, and to really help us to find a path for tackling these issues, not in the distant future, but right now. And I can think of no better person to get us started in this conversation than my colleague, Jennifer Hirsch. She is the director of the Center for Serve, Learn, Sustain here at Georgia Tech, and a longtime colleague. She's a cultural anthropologist who has a very deep experience working in climate justice and racial justice as well. And she has been a champion for the kinds of transformative work that is going on here at Georgia Tech in the classroom and across the campus to help us meet some of the most ambitious challenges in this area. So without further ado, I'll introduce her to provide some opening remarks today. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that generous introduction. It's been really exciting to work with you and the Sea Level Sensors Project and the Global Change Program, and to see Georgia Tech really start to integrate environmental and climate justice issues into its other work related to the natural environment. I am excited to get through my comments and hear the environmental justice panel this morning, because it looks like it's going to be a really exciting discussion. I thought I might open by just sharing a few thoughts, things I've been thinking about related to environmental justice and climate justice, especially during this pandemic, and especially related to what does it mean for us to be at a place like Georgia Tech, engaging as collaborators in this work. And there are a few things I've been thinking about that maybe will provide some food for thought in advance of the panel discussion and the day today. One of them is the true importance that is revealed by this horrible pandemic of systems thinking. We've been trying to really teach systems thinking within our Serve, Learn, Sustain program. But I think this pandemic highlights how incredibly important that is. And the Black Lives Matter movement highlights the importance of considering equity and justice and voice in those systems. It also calls on us to get our own houses in order as central depositories and maintainers of white privilege. So what does it mean for a university or a technological institute like Georgia Tech to really support environmental and climate justice work? One of the things we can do is better support systems thinking, help people understand the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic, the way in which race and class is alive and well, and racism and classism are alive and well in the US and contributing to the disproportionate impacts that we're seeing. And it also helps us reveal the importance of thinking about the connection between communities and nature. And there's some really interesting research emerging around race, class, wildlife. We actually have an event coming up, a virtual event on October 29th, featuring Emily Weigel and Janelle Wright, a faculty member and a graduate student at Georgia Tech, talking about some of this research called Wealth, Race, and Wildlife on October 29th. Maybe somebody can put that link in the chat. So that's one of the things we can do. We can also continue to really think more broadly about our role within the university as partners in environmental and climate justice. And I would recommend Gwen Ottinger's work. She's actually a Georgia Tech alum and now a faculty member at Drexel University. And she has a wonderful book, an edited volume called Technoscience and Environmental Justice, Expert Cultures in a Grassroots Movement. She's also given a talk on that work at Tech, and maybe somebody can put the link to that talk. We have a video recording of it in the text. But she really encouraged us. She really walks through the history of universities and academics supporting the environmental justice movement and has a lot of recommendations of how we can do that better. Here are a couple for us to think about, and then I'll wrap up. One of them is, how do we make data useful to communities? It's not enough to just do our research and hope that communities are able to use the data. We need to be collaborating with communities to figure out what we should collect data on, how we should analyze it, and how we can make it useful to communities and with communities. And we might want to think about establishing things like community IRBs, institutional review boards. Another thing is, how do we, at a place like Georgia Tech, make technological skills useful? So we do a lot of service learning and community engagement and serve, learn, sustain. And we've had a challenge of when the students get to capstone or senior design and they have to use very high level technological skills, it's not so easy to find projects for those students to work with within these ongoing relationships that we have, where they can use those skills in ways that'll help them and also help communities. So we're putting extra efforts into forming collaborations with community partners to figure out how those skills can be beneficial. And the final thing I want to say is I think that all of this work challenges us, and what's happening right now in the world challenges us to think about how we transform our own work and our own institutions overall to be more action-oriented and more supportive of existing community efforts, so that we actually have a system that is educating for sustainable development and environmental and climate justice. How do we become change agents and support our students in being change agents? We can continue to think about things like participatory design, action, research, community engaged teaching, but I think we also need to think bigger about the systems and the collaborative structures that we can put in place that will facilitate the most mutually beneficial and ultimately change-making structures that will create the kind of society we want to create. We're trying to do this right now through a network called RCE Greater Atlanta, and that's another thing perhaps someone can put in the chat if you wouldn't mind, that brings together universities with government and community and nonprofit and business partners all throughout the region to figure out how to collaborate more to create change that we don't even know is possible. So what else might be out there besides these kinds of networks? RCE Greater Atlanta is connected to a network. It's affiliated with the United Nations, and there's over 170 RCEs around the world. That helps us with innovation, and it helps us connect the local to the global. But I want to think myself and encourage others to think about what other types of structures are out there that can change the university as we know it, so that in 50 or 100 years, we prevent these types of pandemics before they start, and we do not see the disproportionate impacts that we see today. Thank you, and I'm excited to listen to the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Hirsch. Good morning. My name is Selena Perrin. I lead the communications team with the Georgia Tech Global Change Program. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to the first ever virtual Global Climate Action Symposium. It is also my pleasure to introduce Charlene DePorter. Charlene DePorter is a doctoral researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies and at the Division of Bioeconomics at the University of Leuven, Belgium. Her research focuses on governance for sustainable development and non-state governance of global trade. More specifically, she has been working on the design and effectiveness of voluntary sustainable standards as a tool for sustainable trade governance. Charlene, welcome.
Hi, welcome everyone. So, thank you very much for inviting me to open this panel on environmental justice. Last weekend, I was watching the movie Erin Brokovich. So, Erin Brokovich tells the true story of a legal battle between a community and a large company named Pacific Gas and Electric Company. And the company polluted the drinking water of the nearby community with chromium-6, which led to people becoming ill and even dying. And it's just one of the many stories which are captured in the literature and research on environmental justice, and research which is concerned with how environmental pollution impacts communities, and especially deprived communities. In many cases, this impact is very direct and can causally be linked to a polluter, which can be held accountable for his or her actions. And you might think that this example is real but less relevant for the debate on climate change and human rights, where often the links between environmental disruption and human rights are indirect and distant. But are there really? Consider the following real case, which we studied for a report for the European Parliament. So in 2015, a climate change case was brought against RWE by Sol Luciano Liula, a Peruvian farmer from the village of Juarez in the Peruvian Andes. And RWE is a German electricity supplying company with headquarters in Essen and sites in Europe, Asia, and the US. And the company is the biggest CO2 emitter among European electricity suppliers. And so Luciano sustained that his house, which is located near a glacial lake, was at imminent risk of being flooded or destroyed by the melting of a glacier into the lake. And indeed, the glacier loses stability because of the glacial melting, which causes a higher risk of a glacial avalanche, and thus makes it possible for a flood wave to emerge from the lake. And he alleged that the melting of the glacier is due to greenhouse gas emissions, which are responsible for global warming. And on 23rd of November 2015, Sol Luciano filed civil proceedings against RWE before the regional court of Essen. And he argued that RWE was liable proportionate to its level of impairment in terms of share of global greenhouse gas emissions to cover the expenses for appropriate safety precautions in favor of the claimant's property from a glacial lake outburst flood from Lake Palchacoa. And the claim in Germany was based on an article which states that if one's ownership is interfered with, the owner may require the disturber to remove the interference. And Sol sustained that German law was the applicable law for this, since RWE emitted emissions in Germany. And Sol alleged that RWE was partly responsible for the flooding risk, as it significantly contributed to global greenhouse gas emissions and thus to climate change. And he argued that RWE should partially pay for preventative measures required to avert or at least to effectively mitigate the consequences of global warming in his area and protect his home. And as a defense, RWE sustained that there was no legal basis for the claims, since civil claims presuppose the existence of an injury and a causal relationship between the injury and the defendant's conduct. And in this case, there was no identifiable linear chain of causation between one particular source of emission to one particular damage. So in other words, RWE argued that a single company cannot be held responsible or partly responsible for the consequences of climate change. And then on 15 December 2016, the Regional Court of Essen dismissed the claim inter alia because of the absence of adequate and equivalent causation of the impairment. The court stated that the pollutants which are emitted by the defendant are merely a fraction of innumerable other pollutants which a multitude of major and minor emitters are emitting and have emitted. It's therefore, according to the court, impossible to identify a linear chain of causation from one particular source of emission to one particular damage. However, the claimant appealed this decision before the higher regional court of Hamm, and on 30 November 2017, the higher regional court reversed the decision of the regional court of Essen, And the court stated that the claimant had demonstrated a sufficient interest, and the court required the parties to designate appropriate experts in order to further explore the case. And these experts should provide evidence on several aspects of the case. And this case is very symbolic, as it is the first German lawsuit in which a company is sued for its role and in its consequences of climate change, including the human rights impact of climate change, such as an impact on the right to property. And what makes the case very symbolic is that a claimant was able to submit that German law was the applicable law on the basis that the event giving rise to the damage occurred in Germany, since this is where the greenhouse gas were emitted. And the consequences of climate change are very real, and they impede on some of the most basic human rights. Holding emitters into account will become a very important issue, and the example of the German case shows that affected communities might have possibilities to hold contributors to climate change to account across the globe, and this possibility might increase in the future, since more and more countries are developing mandatory due diligence legislation and laws, which potentially makes this possible. And this is what we argue in a recent paper in Business and Politics, which appeared online last week, and I'll send the link in the chat right now. And I think this is a very important development to watch and possibly of interest to future researchers. I wish you an engaging and very interesting panel and conference.
Thank you so much for those opening words. Today's events explore the intersection of racial justice and climate action through the lens of equity in our local communities, and expand to include discussion of equity at the international scale. At this virtual symposium, we have the distinct pleasure of welcoming a global audience to join this discussion. I would love to see where everyone in the audience is connecting from. Please share the country or state that you're joining us from in the chat. This morning, we'll listen to a panel discussion, then enjoy a keynote given by Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jouts before concluding the main symposium with a series of short student talks. At 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will have the option to join either a virtual tour of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance or a virtual photography exhibit by Barbara Dombrowski on art and climate justice. Finally, at 12 p.m., there is an opportunity to observe a collective writing workshop, Where to Land After the Pandemic, led by Sohail Hajmirbaba. Links for the virtual tour, exhibit, and workshop can be found in the online agenda hosted on the Georgia Tech Global Change Programs website, globalchange.godtech.edu/GCAS, and will be placed in the event chat. We'll begin with a panel discussion moderated by Bernie Burgener. Bernie is the Executive Director of the Greenhouse Accelerator, where he helps to create sustainable local jobs by advising and financially supporting startup entrepreneurs with clean tech companies. Bernie grew up in Switzerland and then early in his career helped fund and grow businesses in various countries and industries in South America in a financial as well as a consulting function, working for a private investment company out of Lima, Peru. He then worked for several decades with a global water treatment company in Atlanta, leading its international business development. Bernie is an economist by education and a sustainability consultant by avocation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bernie.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning. Good morning to everybody. Let me briefly introduce the panelists first. You have more details on their biographies in the chat, or links. So let me begin with Marta Torjord. Marta is a law professor at the Sorbonne University in Paris. She also leads a research project at Columbia University. She's a lawyer, specialized in environmental law, and more particularly in climate change law. Then we have Jalonne White-Newsome. Jalonne is a senior program director at the Kresge Foundation in Detroit. She's also an adjunct professor for environmental and occupational health at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She earned a PhD in environmental health sciences, a master's in environmental engineering, and a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. Then we have Eboni Preston. Eboni is Director of Operations of the Greening Youth Foundation in Atlanta. He has a master's degree in business administration, in social enterprise administration, and in public administration. And last but not least, we have Rebecca Watts-Hull. Rebecca is a service learning and partnerships specialist for the Center for Serve, Learn, Sustain at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Also an adjunct academic professional in Georgia Tech's School of History and Sociology. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's science degree in natural resources and environment, and a PhD degree in history and sociology of technology and science. So quite a range of interests we cover here. I'm hoping we have a very interactive conversation here, a discussion really on the panel. So panelists, feel free to interrupt me if you want to add to a point that somebody else just made, rather than just going down a preset route. I thought it would be interesting to hear, beyond just these brief introductions of where you're coming from, on this topic of climate justice. What are you most passionate about in your particular lives and professions? So I'd like to begin with Rebecca to just tell us briefly what is most important to you around climate justice.
Thank you, Bernie, and thank you to all the organizers. I'm really happy to be here with you this morning. So I'm really passionate about partnerships, networks, and social movements and how they can advance climate justice, food justice, a more just and sustainable society in all kinds of ways. In my role with Serve, Learn, Sustain, my job is really focused on partnerships, connecting faculty, students, and courses at Georgia Tech with community organizations working on sustainability from a variety of perspectives. And we do that both to amplify the work of those organizations and to build our power to create a more just and sustainable world, and also to equip our Georgia Tech students to be change agents after they graduate and to contribute to a more just and sustainable world. So we come at that from both the education perspective and with a desire to work with our community partners to help them advance change more rapidly in the here and now. And my research has focused on social movements related to environment and sustainability, and particularly campus activism. And one of the ways that I think those of us who are in academia can help advance social movements is by both increasing understanding in the community of how social change happens and how we can be more effective. And I really appreciated the comments of Joel Kresge yesterday about the importance of bringing different kinds of expertise and different kinds of stakeholders to the table around decision making, and the importance of social science, particularly for folks focused in STEM areas. I'm very passionate about figuring out how we grow those partnerships, those networks, in order to amplify the effectiveness that we all can have in advancing climate justice.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. I'd like to find a way to come back to some of this in our discussion. Let me just go around the panel real quick so that everybody can get a bit of a view of where you all are coming from. Eboni, how do you help youth to play an impactful role in making these changes happen?
Sure. So my work in this is creating opportunities and advocating for. So in my work with the Greening Youth Foundation, it's doing just that through saying these are underserved, underrepresented youth and young adults and communities at large. And it's our job to make sure that we're making a space for them and equipping them with the tools to be successful today, but also long term. And I have to say, too, that I am the labor and industry chair for Georgia NAACP, and I see that work, too. So it's not just youth that are underserved and underrepresented. It's also just people. And so really giving light to what it is that's happening within those communities. And again, giving them the access and the space and the resources to not only have the things to be successful themselves and, take that energy that they have and say, hey, this is what's going on, I need to act, but to help them and make sure that they see growth and change.
Great, thank you much, Eboni. Moving on to Marta, can you tell us briefly what excites you about climate justice? Can you hear me, Marta?
Hi, hello.
You may have a delay here.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure. So I don't know if I must say good morning or good afternoon, because in Paris it's 3 p.m. But anyway, hi. Yes, I'm engaged in climate justice since beginning of 2000. So it's been a while. I'm a law professor in La Sorbonne and I'm a senior researcher professor at the National Center for Scientific Research here in France. But I work a lot with international colleagues and fellows. I'm passionate by what I'm doing, so climate change law and more particularly climate justice. I have two main fields of activities and research. One is my research and practice in bringing together people interested on climate change and climate justice. Means that I put together through a network that I created 3 years ago. I put together researchers, academics, lawyers, judges, and civil society and think tanks, NGOs too, in order to create some kind of dynamic energy to improve climate justice here in France and, if possible, in the European context. So in this aspect, we organize events, academic events, we do publications, and we have quite active network of information and communication. And my second field of activity and engagement for climate justice is more in the expertise field, because I work a lot with scientifics, climate change scientifics, and with climate change science. So I try to put together social science, law, and climate science. So in this aspect, I also organize a lot of events, I do publications, and we try to help some NGOs or lawyers that are engaged in that field, or climate scientists, to better communicate their scientists and expertise to help, for example, climate change litigation and actions before the court, to better have a best access to expertise in that field and to contribute to improve climate justice. That's more or less what I do.
Great, thank you much, Marta. Love to come back to some of that as well. We have a limited time here, so we got to be careful what topics we pick and make relevant to our audience, but hopefully we can touch on some of that. Jalonne, just coming to you, can you tell us real quickly what is most important to you around climate justice?
Yeah, well, good morning, and thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. And I want to start out by acknowledging that I'm calling from the indigenous lands of the Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, and the Mississauga in West Bloomfield, Michigan. We can't talk about climate justice until we acknowledge the injustices that have been done to many folks across this country. I also want to acknowledge the first responders, the medical practitioners, the frontline leaders that are responding to so many climate disasters, to racial injustice, and those that continue to fight for the right and access to care in this pandemic. I've been working on environmental justice and climate justice issues for over 20 years, starting in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. So it's been something that's been a part of my life for a long time. And I had the opportunity to be an advocate, environmental justice policy person, and that was before I got to philanthropy, where I now sit. And so I'm going to speak from the perspective of why I am passionate about environmental philanthropy at the Kresge Foundation and what I'm able to do to really build on our mission of advancing opportunities for low-income communities in America's cities. I sit in our environment program, and our mission is to help build climate resilient communities. But as most of you know, and by our first speaker, institutions have been a big part of the problem in achieving climate justice and environmental justice. So some of the observations that I came into philanthropy with, and my passion for what I've been trying to do in philanthropy to disrupt it, is really around who we fund and how we fund. And I'm sure we'll have more conversation about that, but essentially Black-led organizations, Brown-led organizations, Indigenous organizations have not been funded ever at the level that they need to be, and philanthropy is changing. The way that we make the process hard for certain groups to access funding, to get into the process and understand the black box of philanthropy has been ridiculous, but it is changing. So again, that's what I bring to this work in environmental philanthropy, is my passion for just making sure my folks, my family, my people are represented and funded to do the great work that they do. So I look forward to discussion. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you much, Jalonne. Appreciate your time there. I was hoping to that giving this brief overview of where you're coming from will encourage our audience to come up with some questions to you as we go through the discussions here. So please feel free to put that into the Q&A box, and we pick it up when we can. I thought I would just like to continue with you, Jalonne, there. The panels through this week, through these 3 days, have really a very strong academic bent, right? Very little on business activities. You might be a bit of a connection to that side, because obviously, unless on climate justice business buys into this, we're going to be way short of making change happen. Can you talk to us a bit, perhaps, on when it comes to your funding activities at the Kresge organization? And you fund these organizations, probably most of them nonprofits and others, but perhaps also some for-profits. Can you give some examples of what you fund and why you fund these organizations?
Sure. So as I said, I sit in the environment program at Kresge, and we fund all levels of organizations and urban leaders that can help build climate resilience. So specifically, I work on climate-driven urban flooding. My colleague works on energy. And we fund in a couple of different ways. We fund individual organizations, and we also do a lot of funding of national coalitions, and we also fund what we call initiatives, so groups of or cohorts of organizations that are funded over multiple years. I would say the thing that has driven our funding is really understanding that you can't only just fund the academics, you can't only fund the mainstream white-led environmental organizations, you have to fund the community organizations that have the expertise to drive both an inside and outside push for change. And so what we've done, for example, is fund coalitions like the Policy Link Water Equity Climate Resilience Caucus, which provides support, technical assistance, and opportunities for solidarity among 90 plus organizations across this country, frontline grassroots organizations that are working to advance water policy, not only at the federal level, but the national and state level. But then we also fund organizations that are helping us build the case to do smart climate stuff. So organizations like Earth Economics that help us really understand and work directly with our community-based organizations to not only have the lived experience, but couple that with dollars and cents as to why you should provide green stormwater infrastructure as a solution versus your typical concrete solution. And then I would say we also support innovative practices. And so when you have a foundation, you have the opportunity to not only do grant funding, but sometimes mission-related investments. So using other forms of capital like loans and guarantees. So for example, we support a minority women-owned business, Greenprint Partners out of Chicago, that their mission is to build and promote green stormwater infrastructures in places that probably wouldn't get it. So churches, community development centers, things of that nature. So again, our goal is to build climate resilience, knowing that we need all these different partners from city level practitioners to academicians to community groups to really make the change in the sectors that we're trying to move: energy, water, and then the broader climate resilience and climate adaptation field.
Great, good to hear. Trying to make a leap here from what you said to making some of the things that Rebecca does with students. You were saying earlier that you work a lot with students, bringing that kind of thinking to the classrooms. How do you see this working, or how do you see this being impactful, looking at students as these future leaders who might build a business like this, whether it's a social enterprise or part of an institution, wherever it is? How do you work with students? How do you talk to them to open their minds and give them sort of a tool set to actually build initiatives like that? You're muted.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Thank you, Bernie. First, I'd like to just piggyback a little bit and thank Jalonne. I'm so happy to hear about the direction that Kresge Foundation is going in terms of a focus on capacity building and those networks and caucuses, because that hasn't traditionally always been the first area that foundations and funders look for. The incredibly important capacity building and relationship building and strategizing that happens behind the scenes that makes change happen. That is so important to support, and cooperation amongst these organizations instead of pitting them against each other in competition for funding, which was sometimes my experience working in the environmental nonprofit community. So I appreciate hearing that so much. And I think one of the areas of overlap with what we do at Serve, Learn, Sustain with students, to Bernie's question, relates to what you were saying about really centering Black and Brown-led organizations. So with Serve, Learn, Sustain, we've really focused on centering equity amongst the 3 E's of sustainability, which has oftentimes been sort of an afterthought. After the environmental and economic E's and sustainability. So we have been working to really center equity, and more recently to increase our focus on centering racial equity in our work on equitable and sustainable development with students, both in through coursework, through curriculum, and through the community partnerships that we have. So we've prioritized in our partnership strategy Black and Brown-led organizations as well as the communities that are closest to Georgia Tech's campus. So that's an area of overlap there. And to the second part of your question, Bernie, about capacity. So how are we working to equip students to do this work after graduation? One of the ways that we do that is how we model partnerships and how we approach partnerships with students. We focus on an approach called asset-based community development, or ABCD approaches, that begin with assets rather than a deficit or need-based perspective on communities. And the second thing that we do is really provide the experiential education so they can begin working with organizations while they're still students, learn how that can be messy and hard, learn from the experiences that they have, begin to figure out where they see themselves fitting in, because there are roles for all different kinds of expertise and skills and inclinations, insider and outsider, as Jalonne was saying, in the climate justice movement and in advancing sustainability. And we're also working to really try to make the case for cross-disciplinary and transdisciplinary, and as Jenny was saying this morning, systems-based thinking. So students are not just thinking about what is the technological fix for this particular situation, but what is the human system look like, and how do these pieces fit together? And to give you one small example, I'm currently teaching a class in community organizing. So we're trying to integrate understanding of the social systems with understanding of the natural systems and technology for our students.
Great, thanks. Which leads me right to Eboni, right? You sort of in parallel to that, you work with youth. You help them as you meet them, maybe with goals and dreams like that. How do you do that? Can you tell us some examples of sort of success stories around youth and their impact?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'll start by saying too that so our youth are typically between the ages of 18 and 35. And so for the sense of our program and just kind of the jargon that we have to use with our partners, they're youth, but aside from that, we kind of leave it there. We say that they're people, they're passionate about the work, and we just need to give them the platform to do it. And so we've created internship programs and apprenticeship style programs that really put them in the field. And no slight to internships that we've maybe done. I know I did them where, I made coffee and copies, and that was kind of the extent of it. We say, no, like this is a working interview. So they have responsibility from the beginning. There's a level of rigor that our students are expected to have and go through and make sure that they're perform and they're accountable. They're a part of a team. They're working alongside federal agencies, the National Park Service, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, the list goes on, with community partners, things like that. And they have real responsibilities to the communities that they're working in, to the teams that they're on, and then to their communities back home. So it may be that I have a young person coming from Atlanta and they need to go to Montana to really make sure that they're equipped to know everything that's happening here. Bringing that back home to let their community know, hey, you can go to Montana and work, but then also I have these newfound skills and resources and techniques and opportunities that I want to show you. So really just giving these young people who sometimes never even knew that they had a space in here, especially when it comes to employment, to say not only can you do this, but there's a larger lesson too that you can share with your community.
Great. You were mentioning employment. Do you work also with youth who actually want to build their own social enterprise, for example, around an issue and solving an issue?
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. So while our participants work with our partners, so maybe in the field with them specifically, a big part of the work that the Greenie Youth Foundation does is the soft skill training. We say, hey, partners, you have all the technical stuff, the things that you need out there in the field. But with us, especially knowing that we're working with underserved, underrepresented youth and young adults, sometimes they say, I don't see myself in the work, or at least the way others have outlined it. So we're giving them trainings talking about building businesses, as you said. We're talking about financial literacy. We're giving them professional networks and mentors and coaching and things like that. And so we have a program that's local to Atlanta, our Urban Youth Corps, and we have a 3.5-acre farm in the city. And when we bring our young people there, it's about urban agriculture and horticulture and animal husbandry and things like that. And people are like, oh, this is really cool. But then they find a lot of difficulty, even though they have the credentials and the network and things like that, getting a job or at least having a livable wage. So they say, I want to make my own. And a lot of them have done that. And then they go on to get contracts with some of the partners that we had them interning with. So there is a lot of success in that space. And I think when we can give them that ownership, it only empowers them to do more.
Great, thanks. Marta, I'd like to come to you, because we've talked about, we heard so far what is in front and center here locally, or let's say in the US. You also obviously working out of France, your work extends into Europe, but you're also working with Columbia University over here. Can you tell us a bit how the importance of climate change, the issues around climate justice are different where you live and in your daily work from what concerns us over here mainly?
Well, this is a very tricky question, as you have United States president that is not really climate change friendly. Though the situation is quite different from France. We have another point of view from the government is a little more climate change friendly. So the political context is quite different, which means that the actions are also different. But from the academic point of view, which is mine, of course, we have a very nice cooperation with the Earth Institute in Columbia University, and more particularly the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, with whom I work since several years. And from the legal point of view, we have many common interests and common actions, because both from the university we try to bring capacity to the civil society, to lawyers who are engaged in climate justice, and even judges that are interested in learn more and have this new culture, legal culture of climate change and of climate justice. So from this aspect, it's more or less the same what we do. We teach climate change law. We form students to fight and to understand what climate change law and climate justice means. And we try to bring this kind of science to the civil society. So it's more or less the same. The difference maybe, and I will finish with that, is that in France it's maybe easier to collaborate with public institutions that are already having some kind of thoughts about climate justice. We have since 2 years, for example, in France, the Haut Conseil pour le Climat is the High Council for climate change, and we can help them to, write advices and opinions. So we are there to help them each time they ask us for expertise. And also, since last year in France, we have a new very innovative institution, which is for democracy and climate change, which is the Convention Citoyenne. That is the Citoyenne Convention, and it's citizens that were chosen completely azar and 150, and they were brought together, and each weekend for 9 months they reunited and had meetings, each only during the weekend, because they are benevolent, they are non-profit, and they brought some propositions to the government in order to modify and improve climate change laws in France. So this is quite different from the United States, but the situation is not the same.
Are you working with private business as well, for-profit or non-profit businesses, in a sort of from the point of view of communicating the science of this?
You mean private actors like firms and multinational? Well, when they are open to participate to the seminars and workshops and conference that we organize, yes, we invite them, because it's interesting from us to know what they do and what they are able to do, and from them to know what we are doing. So yes, because I'm always in this collaboration spirit, which I think is what makes things go, advance and go further. But sometimes, this communication is easy and sometimes it's a little harder. So it all depends on the people that are out there and ready to communicate with us and collaborate.
Right. Do you have any success stories, any particular examples that might be enlightening in this context?
It's always with two different. It had two different phases, I will say. So many firms have a sustainable development legal department. So with this kind of department is very easy and nice to talk, and there are many things to put in common and to improve. And you have other departments that are more worried on making profits and doing business as usual. So in the same firm, you can have both sides. So, things are not black and white, things are more gray or green sometimes, and we try to make things slowly but surely.
Okay, great. So we touched a bit on, let's call it individual actions. We touched on corporate initiatives. One aspect that came out earlier was on sort of the government level, policy level, relative to alleviating some of these issues around climate justice. Rebecca, that was something you brought up earlier. Do you want to comment on, maybe give some examples, success stories when it comes to policies, what works, what doesn't work in this regard?
Sure, thank you. So I think one example that might help show what's been effective in environmental justice and climate justice fights, as well as what more is needed, is the successful battle against the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was defeated just a few months ago after a 6-year fight and very coordinated effort that involves some major legal-oriented environmental organizations, many grassroots organizations in North Carolina, West Virginia, and Virginia, and many, many community leaders. And the coordination of all of those actors was very, very key to the success in shifting the public discourse around that pipeline and whether it was necessary or not. And in many ways, it had a lot in common with many environmental justice fights, because there were low-income communities and communities of color that would have been disproportionately impacted by the risks and hazards, as well as air and water pollution that would have resulted from that pipeline. At the same time, it's a really important climate justice fight because it would have been a significant investment in the continuation of our dependence on fossil fuels. So it was a very important climate justice win. But to your question about policy, the legal fight centered around 50-year-old landmark environmental laws. So they used the Clean Water Act, they used the Endangered Species Act, they used NEPA to challenge the permits that had been given for that pipeline. It's been a very long time since the environmental movement and the climate movement, and the US has been successful in winning new policy, and policy that is specifically designed to aggressively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that example both shows what's been effective and the effectiveness of policies put in place by the 1970s environmental movement, but how we've really had a very hard time over the past several decades getting new legislation that helps us work more proactively to address climate change at the level of urgency that is really required now.
Great, thanks for that. I was checking in the Q&A box just to bring some questions from the audience to this discussion as well. One came up relative to what Jalonne does at the Kresge Foundation, specifically around your funding activities for supporting networks, the building of networks, the relationship building. Can you talk to that a little bit and maybe give us some examples of what worked?
Sure. So I guess I want to appreciate Marta bringing out the kind of the similarities and the differences in the places where we work. And definitely these past couple of years have been a challenge in terms of moving climate policy. And so when I was working in DC for We Act for Environmental Justice, part of my job was to lead national coalitions, the Environmental Justice Climate Change Forum for several years. And, you know, again, we were able to get much traction because having a concerted voice from folks across the country and then pushing our federal agencies to think differently and do better was so critical. And so to the question of the networks and caucuses that Kresge supports, I would say, I would give a couple examples. We support a lot of them, but we support them with the goal of, again, changing hearts and minds so we can keep people centered in whatever solutions at whatever level and whatever power and privilege you have. So one example is the U.S. Water Alliance, which is, I would say when I started at Kresge, mostly water utility leaders, mostly white, focused on just kind of the utility space. What we have supported is building, helping the Alliance build a national water equity agenda that I think has had reverberating effects across many different communities. But in particularly the water equity tables that have been set up in specific cities that pull together folks in the city of Atlanta, both community folks, utilities, local foundations, to have a conversation and set a shared agenda around what it means to advance water equity in the city of Atlanta, in the city of Buffalo, in the city of Detroit, in all the other cities. So that is an example of one kind of network that has put equity in the center, and that again resonates among these different types of folks that need to make change. I would also say, as it relates to national policy, we've supported the National Climate Justice Platform, which is maybe something that you all saw in the news, I want to say several months ago, but basically brought together many frontline and grassroots leaders to create a national policy platform. Even in the midst of the challenges we've had with this administration in terms of dismissing the importance of climate change and dismissing the importance of Black and brown voices, these folks were able to come together we were part of that support to create this national agenda that has been used to shape many of the policy, I would say, pledges of folks that are running for positions right now. But the beauty is that these national coalitions, whether it be the U.S. Water Alliance, the Environmental Justice Climate Platform, it does nothing if you don't help build the local infrastructure. And so I would say that a couple of the folks that so many people that I'm proud of, but the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice is working in several Gulf Coast communities with community-based organizations that are building those local networks to incite change. And I want to really point out one, Unity in the Family Ministry in Florida that just recently brought in data, GIS. I had technical experts working with community to really convince their county, Escambia County, that they needed to have an environmental justice commission, which will then do equity analysis on every policy and practice that they try and put forward in their community, and particularly around urban flooding and climate injustices. So again, the importance of the caucuses and the networks we support at multiple levels is what it's going to take for us to really achieve climate justice. So that's just a snap, but there's so much great work going on, and so proud of folks.
Thank you much. Thank you much. I read earlier around what Kresge does and what kind of projects you support. You do a lot of great work there. Much appreciated. That, as I think Rebecca pointed out earlier too, finding funding, or I think Jenny mentioned that as well. Finding funding for some of those efforts is always a huge undertaking. And to know that somebody like you is around to do that, much appreciated. Thank you very much. I love another question that came up from the audience. We've been talking about climate justice in the framework of our communities, the greater local area. But obviously we all know climate change is a global phenomenon. And much of what we do here relative to impacting climate change, those impacts are not down the street. Those impacts are all over the globe, literally. So as soon as you discuss that, migration becomes a big issue, right? We see that already now, that because of rising seawater levels, because of too much water coming down, not enough water coming down, migration is induced. Life becomes impossible in some of the areas that people now live. Would be interesting to hear some of your views and comments and experience with this, and how we help dealing with this issue, which is another reason why I like this. The issue here doesn't have to be why climate change happens and whether we even have something to do with it. We don't have to convince somebody that we contribute to it. Let's focus on dealing with the issues that result, no matter what the cause. So perhaps starting with Marta, who's in Europe, close to rather big migration issues. What do you see there? What kind of work do we do? Do you think we could do to help dealing with this particular consequence of climate change?
Well, thanks for this question, which is indeed a very broad question. Well, I think the main point here is to ask ourselves if this climate change migration is really a climate change migration, or if it is an economic migration that it's harder because of climate change. So the origin is not only climate change, right? It's also economic, social, and political, and wars, and a lot of other reasons. I'm not saying that climate change is not worsening it, but it's not the only reason for this migration. So once we have made this distinction or this point, climate change migration is a reality. And the origin is probably not only environmental reasons, but economic reasons. I mean, if some people have no more water, it's not only because there are desertification or no more biodiversity or no more natural resources. It's also because something happened that make that people weren't living in very good conditions with not very high quality of life. So the problem is not only environmental, it's also social and political. So this is when climate justice brings environmental justice, which is also social and economic justice. More precisely, in France, we have not climate change migration. We have other kinds of migration, and this is a very big problem in all Europe, not only in France. And we try to deal with it with more or less is, of course, more than a justice. Climate change is more an injustice. War situation in general. So it's, of course, global. So what I can say to maybe bring some ideas to that debate is that maybe we should think about the reasons why some people have to deal harder with the fatality to have to leave their countries. And we should ask ourselves on those reasons. It's not only climate change. That's what I will say.
Thanks, Marta. Eboni, do you come across that particular kind of issue with the youth you're working with?
Yeah, and I definitely come across it with NAACP. I think that my response to that, though, is that a lot of the communities that I work with, they don't have, and I'm saying luxury, but the luxury of migrating, right? So they have to figure out, how do we make do? How do we figure out resources? I mean, I'm in Atlanta, and here we are 15 years post-Katrina. There's a lot of folks around me that are from Louisiana. So yes, they had the pleasure of moving, but I frequently go back to Louisiana, and in certain parts, it still looks like it's 2005, right? And so there's a lot of displacement there, and we talk about that, or moving and things like that. And the same with the youth, like they're putting those burdens on them, and that's why in those positions they're like, okay, if I'm going to do this, like I have to be intentional about this work. I mean, we've heard about the different layers from philanthropy to academia to service, and so it's like, how can we move and take collective action? And so I think that our youth are seeing that there's no, pathway or pipeline, things that are already kind of planned out. This is how you do it. This is how we see change, that they have to bring innovation to that work, into how we solve these bigger issues that we see. So it's something that they recognize, that they see the burdens on their parents, they feel the burdens themselves, and they don't want that to be for the next generation. So I would say that it's empowered them.
Great, thanks. This touches a bit on, I think, what you mentioned, Rebecca, earlier, sort of connecting the dots, right? To see the bigger picture in relative to the impacts of our actions, which are not always so obvious to us, and they are oftentimes geographically far away. Sometimes they are on a timeline that's much further down the road. And can you expand a little bit from your own experience in your work? What might help here to deal with this particular issue of migration?
Wow, that's a big question.
Sorry to throw it your way. I thought you could deal with it.
Well, let me try and slice off a slightly smaller piece of that. I wanted to go back to something Jalonne mentioned earlier with respect to Kresge's climate resilience work, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but you referred to supporting Black and Brown communities to really lead conversations and decision making about climate resilience. And that is something I'd like to underscore as incredibly critical here. One, I'm a sociologist by training, and there have been sociological studies showing that inequities have actually been increased when areas have rebuilt post-disaster. So who is sitting at the table making the decisions about both planning for resilience and then rebuilding or reimagining after a climate-related disaster has occurred is critically important. And those who are most vulnerable in the most vulnerable communities really need to play a central role in determining decisions. And of course, that means, back to your systems thinking question, that means understanding systemic racism and inequities that have long existed in our cities and throughout our society, so that those can be disrupted in the way that we approach our response to climate and making communities resilient. The other thing I would say, and I suspect Nataki is really going to expand on this in her talk. Eboni, I heard you mention I See Change. I'm not sure if you were referring to the organization in New Orleans, but the data collection, the community-based data collection and community science is an area where we at academic institutions can really partner effectively with communities, and again, help empower communities to document themselves what change is occurring. And that is also closely related to this question of climate resilience and enhancing resilience.
Before you go on, Eboni, on this, we are checking on the time here. We have only a good 2 minutes left. Maybe anyone who, after Eboni, can have just a quick thought on resilience, if that's on top of your mind, so that we can close in on time. Eboni?
Just sort of echoing what Rebecca said, I guess.
Yeah.
And just to
make everybody aware that we're close to 9:15.
Yeah. So just kind of in the interest of brevity, like I said, 100% supporting what Rebecca had said, but just kind of seeing that, I guess we got to keep the people in the work. And Dr. White-Newsome said that in the beginning, like we have to focus this in that, yes, we have systems problems and law problems and like all of these things, but we have to keep it centered around the people. And if we don't do that, we're not going to see change, or we do see change, but it's not in the interest of the people that need it so desperately. So I think the advocacy here that we've seen from all of these different lenses is really important, all to better make motion for the people who have really been marginalized and disenfranchised.
Great, thanks. Jalonne, a quick last word from you on that topic?
Yeah, quick last word, I'll try. The way we think about resilience, we need to change it. The communities that we're speaking of today that have been disproportionately impacted for so long have been beyond resilient for too long. So how do we not make resilience something that is a badge of honor for these communities, but something that really should be an asset and a part of how the communities and systems are? So how can we begin to make the systems and the institutions more resilient so the people don't have to be as resilient? So I'll just end with that.
Thank you. I'll give the very last word to you, Marta.
Be brief. Well, I think it's interesting to connect always global with local, as you said at the beginning. And for that, 3 actions for me are really important. First, the international negotiations, and to put climate justice at the heart and the core of the Paris Agreement, which is not presently. So to give to this definition a more, more presence and more height. To continue to help NGOs and citizens to bring justice actions into courts when necessary, to reestablish an equilibrium and climate justice when needed, and 3, to push governments all around the world to do actions and to improve climate change laws and social laws in order to reduce differences, inequalities, and injustice related to climate change.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We close it here. Our time is up. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate your efforts. Give it back to Zelena.
Thank you so much for that engaging panel discussion. So now we'll take a short break before being joined by today's keynote speaker, Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks, at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're just joining us now, please feel free to share what country or state you're connecting with us from in the chat. Additionally, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A, and our panelists can answer them. And additionally, we'll continue to answer these questions throughout the symposium. Please remember that beginning at 11:30 today, we'll be using 2 separate webinar links, one of which will lead you through a virtual tour of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, and another which will lead you through a photography exhibition by Barbara Dombrowski on art and climate justice. Additionally, at noon, there is an opportunity to observe a writing workshop called Where to Land After the Pandemic, led by Sohail Harimbaba. Links for all of these are available online in your agenda, and a shortcut link will be shared in the event chat. The experiences will be fully recorded and archived on your virtual event dashboard on Eventbrite. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you all after the break.
Okay, everybody. I think we're going to resume here at the second day of the Global Climate Action Symposium. And I am just, ablaze with all the insights from this morning. Frankly, what an amazing panel. Thank you to all the panelists and to Bernie as well. And I just wanted to remind folks that if you, like me, were trying to jot down some of those pearls of wisdom as they flew by and you found yourself overwhelmed by all the pearls, please do go to our website at globalchange.gatech.edu/GCAS and register so that you can gain access to all of those recordings that will be available after the event. So that's a great reason to register right there. To gain access to that. So again, I was so humbled and inspired by the conversation and eager to continue it with our keynote speaker today, Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks. For us Atlantans who have been working in climate and especially environmental justice, this is a local heroine who almost needs no introduction, but I know that we do have a very large international audience as well today, and it is such a treat to share her experiences and her work and her passion with you today. So let me briefly introduce her before I get started. Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks is an assistant professor in the Environmental and Health Sciences program at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. As an environmental health scientist, an environmental justice scholar, Dr. Jelks investigates urban environmental health disparities and the role that place, race, and social factors play in influencing health, cumulative risk assessment, and the connection between urban watersheds, pollution, the built environment, and health. She also develops, implements, and evaluates community-based initiatives that empower low-income and communities of color to reduce exposure to environmental health hazards and improve health and quality of life. Dr. Jelks co-founded the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, a community-based environmental justice organization that works to grow a cleaner, greener, healthier, and more sustainable West Atlanta through authentic community engagement, organizing, education, community science, and research. And as before I let Nataki take it away, I wanted to remind folks that a virtual tour of the West Atlanta Watershed is featured as one of our end of morning events. So please do stick around for that. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Osborne-Jelks. It is a treat to have you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cobb. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I am going to attempt to share my screen here, and already I am not seeing what we practiced. in terms of what's available. Hold on just a second here. Maybe I just found it, perhaps. So let me just sort of add a little bit. Again, I want to thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this gathering on today. As I try to fumble, I may have to ask for assistance with my slides because, okay, thank you so much.
Let me share my screen and I can drive this PowerPoint.
Okay, somehow I knew this was going to happen, but hopefully we can make it through. There's backup available. So I'm excited to share today. I definitely am going to talk a lot from my local perspective in terms of the local work that I do, but I want to kind of tie several things together. So we'll talk a little bit about climate because I do this work from an environmental health perspective. I'll also talk about impacts to health, and then bring in and sort of tie in and intersect issues of climate with environmental justice, and talk to you about why I feel that climate justice, which was just talked about and referenced in the last panel, is environmental justice. So thank you so much for sharing that. You can go on to this, to the next slide, please. So what I thought I would just begin with is kind of sharing with you a conceptual framework of climate change and health, because I am attacking this work from the perspective of health. And in just a minute, I'll tell how I got engaged in this work. And it's because of my interest in health issues and because of some personal impacts that I experienced with respect to health that sort of turned the light bulbs on for me. So when we think about climate change, and I know that this audience perhaps knows a lot about climate change. There are scholars, there are folks who are working on the ground on climate issues, and so you don't need me to, go on and on ad nauseum about the connections. But when we think about the connections with respect to climate change and health, there are a lot of potential adverse health effects that are associated with climate change. Things that are associated with extreme weather events, health effects that are associated with extreme heat, health effects that are associated with flooding and displacement of communities. You get it. The list sort of goes on and on. We could talk about infectious diseases, and we can also talk about air pollution, and I'll touch on that just a little bit today with respect to those associated health effects, respiratory illnesses. Next slide, please. Also, when we think about climate change, I again am sort of attacking this work from an environmental health perspective. And so climate change impacts the environmental determinants of health. And in fact, climate change impacts those determinants in a detrimental way. Next slide, please, if it will advance. I want to kind of share some of these impacts. And you can go back one. So without us addressing and attacking climate change, it is compromising and will continue to compromise things such as water quality and quantity, food security, control of infectious disease, as well as protection from disasters. Next slide. There are lots of health effects that are associated with climate change, again, and I've kind of briefly touched upon some of these, but I think that this timing could not be more profound for us to think about those health effects as we think about what's happening worldwide. But if we kind of center in on the United States for just a minute, as we think about what's happening on our West Coast with the wildfires, and we think about what's happening on our East Coast and in the Gulf Coast region with respect to hurricanes and extreme storm events, we have to center these issues around health because whole communities are being impacted. On just yesterday, I was on a call with colleagues in New Orleans, and they were saying, we don't know what's going to happen. We're hoping that we don't have to evacuate. And so this is a reoccurring theme, whether we're talking about the West Coast or the East or Gulf Coast regions. And so we cannot ignore these temperature-related illnesses and death, the extreme weather-related health effects, air pollution-related health effects, water and foodborne disease illnesses, vector-borne and rodent-borne diseases, effects of food and water shortages, as well as the effects of population displacement. Again, we are living this in live live and in color right now at this very moment. We could also just talk very briefly about COVID-19, this pandemic that is dominating our lives, especially in the United States, but worldwide, as it is a pandemic. And as we think about COVID-19, what is so profound is that the layers of inequities and inequalities we're able to see them in perhaps a more clear way than we've ever seen them before. When we think about the pandemic, it's becoming clear that, several months into this, that environmental and climate factors are helping to shape the landscape in which COVID-19 proliferates around the world. And it's also influencing the public health responses to the pandemic, as well as interactions with existing environmental health disparities. Climate and weather extremes may not only affect the transmission of SARS-CoV-2, of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but also the ability of our health systems and our local communities to respond effectively. As we are, in this pandemic, in the midst of this pandemic, every time I hear about communities having to be evacuated, people having to flee from their homes, I think about those communities and those residents of places across our globe who don't have a lot of monetary resources, for whom evacuating from home means that they may have to go into shelter-type situations. And here in places like Atlanta, we've seen some of the responses to the homeless, for instance, in the midst of this pandemic, where there have been hotels that have been set aside to shelter people, to try to shelter them safely in the midst of this pandemic. Regular shelters that operate, in emergency response for emergency response purposes are not even able to handle the capacity that they normally handle because of social distancing requirements, because of this pandemic. So there are lots of challenges with respect to the populations that are hit hardest and that are most impacted by climate factors. These same populations are also being largely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So the theme for today is environmental justice. And so while I know that I don't have to kind of go through and give sort of an environmental justice 101 lecture, what I thought would be important is to share the definition of environmental justice that I'm working from. As it may be slightly different from some of the textbook definitions that we see with respect to environmental justice that might come from agencies like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And these are broad definitions, but I wanted to kind of key into a couple of things here. So, and let me just read from my notes. Environmental justice is the right to a decent, safe quality of life for people of all races, incomes, and cultures in the environments where we live, work, play, worship, and learn. When we talk about environmental justice, it emphasizes accountability, democratic practices, equitable treatment, and self-determination. Environmental justice principles, and there are 17 of them, these principles prioritize the common good over profit and over greed. They also emphasize cooperation and collaboration over competition, community and collective action over individualism, and precautionary approaches over unacceptable risks. Environmental justice provides a framework for communities of color to articulate the political, economic, and social assumptions underlying why environmental racism and degradation happens and how it continues to be institutionally reinforced. So that's environmental justice. Now I want to talk just briefly about climate justice. Next slide, please. And as I just briefly mentioned earlier, climate justice, from my vantage point, is environmental justice. Climate justice is about making change to root problems, making systemic changes that are required to address unequal burdens to our communities and to realign our economy with natural systems. If you think about it in terms of the climate crisis that we experience today, there is a huge impact on our natural systems, but a lot of it is aligned with our economy. It's aligned with the way that we do business. It's aligned by the ways that we live our everyday lives in the society in which, in many cases, kind of these individual rights are elevated. You know, our right to, you know, live in certain places, our right to drive certain vehicles, our rights to refuse public transportation in our communities if we don't want certain people to be able to have access to our neighborhoods. So we have to think about the way that our economy operates and how that impacts our natural systems. Again, climate justice is a form of environmental justice, and it means that all species have the right to access and obtain the resources needed to have an equal chance of survival and freedom from discrimination. So a lot of times in the context of sustainable development, we talk about the responsible use of resources, and we talk about equity from an intergenerational perspective, you know, using our resources responsibly today so that future generations have everything that they need to thrive and to be successful as well. As a movement, climate justice advocates are working from the grassroots up to create solutions to our climate and energy problems that assure the right of all people to live, learn, work, play, and pray in safe, healthy, and clean environments. And a lot of what I'll talk about today is about the work that happens at the community level. Next slide. So before I get into that, I want to kind of, you know, talk about why there is so much action happening from the community level. There are lots of communities on the front lines of environmental and climate justice struggles who would say that their neighborhoods are killing them. And that might seem pretty drastic from some vantage points. But from my vantage point, you know, as an environmental health scientist, you know, I really look at and know that residents of low income and communities of color suffer disproportionately from negative environmental factors, from poor environmental quality, from substandard housing, from lack of access to healthy food options, lack of access to clean, affordable drinking water, and lack of access to clean, safe, open spaces, such as parks and playgrounds. When we can also look at other factors in these communities, like the lack of access to high-paying jobs, inadequate access to health care and other crucial services, as well as fractured social networks in some ways. Next slide, please. And so while I said that, you know, it might seem a little bit drastic, ask folks in Flint, Michigan, who are still battling to receive clean water. You may have heard about a recent settlement, you know, in Flint, but what residents say is that the money that has been awarded as a part of this settlement really does not begin to address the health challenges, the stress, everything that people in this community have faced as a result of being poisoned in their water. Next slide. Also, in terms of other places in the country, I really enter this work because I grew up for a portion of my life in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is part of the Cancer Alley corridor. And here you see sort of an aerial view of a lot of the facilities in Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley is this 85-mile stretch of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana, which houses over 135 or so chemical companies, petrochemical companies, and other pollution-generating facilities. The people who live in this corridor have high rates of cancer. In past years, there have been high rates of birth defects, miscarriages, respiratory illnesses, you name it. These communities have faced them. Many of these communities are low-income communities and live right along the fence lines of these facilities. I actually grew up in a middle-class neighborhood, but we were also in very close proximity to polluting facilities in the Cancer Alley corridor. Next slide. And this next slide just shows, you know, when I talk about communities sort of living along the fence lines, you see right here a basketball court built by a facility kind of as a gift to the community, you know, to perhaps, you know, sort of combat you know, the waste and the pollution that is, you know, being piped out of its smokestacks. Next slide, please. When we think about the health challenges in these areas, we can, you know, also look at those social determinants of health, things that I just mentioned in terms of income level, in terms of access to quality education. All of these things are compounded for these communities that are also facing these environmental health risks and threats. And so the results are chronic health conditions such as asthma and other respiratory illnesses, as well as things that are a lot more serious like cancer. Next slide. In this next slide, I'll be showing you my sort of neighborhood facility in Baton Rouge that my middle class neighborhood was in less than a mile away from. I still have a family home in this area. My brother still lives in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, with his family. And he still lives in our family home, which is, again, less than a mile away from this facility. And so I really got encouraged and really compelled to be engaged in this work to fight for environmental justice after my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. It's not that we can make any clear connections between what we were exposed to in this area and her diagnosis, but just the fact that this possibility exists really gave me the impetus to get involved, to be a part of the change process for communities. Not only did she have breast cancer, and thank God she is a survivor, but anecdotally, I could really connect my time in Louisiana to health issues of my own, things that didn't happen to me before I moved to Louisiana, like a lot of discoloration on my skin, what the doctors called hypopigmentation, but they could never figure out what was causing it after giving me a battery of allergy tests. And so again, this is just anecdotal information, anecdotal evidence. But I could really draw some linkages to what I was not experiencing before I moved to Louisiana and what went away. My symptoms went away after I moved. So, just a little something to think about, but all of those dots connected with the fact that, I remember vividly how the air pollution index was always high. The water always smelled and tasted bad. The air smelled of these facilities. And so connecting those dots for me just gave me a lot to think about and this impetus to try to be a change agent. Next slide, please. So I'll kind of sort of end this sort of piece of the presentation by saying that the urban environment is a determinant of health. I think the slide is a little bit cut off there, but that's what it's supposed to say. When we think about our urban environments across the world, communities are becoming a lot more urbanized. When we think about the United States, and we're in a census year, but when we look back at the data from the 2010 census and some of the updates that we've seen incrementally since then, we know that over 250 million people in the United States live in urban environments. They make up about 80.7% of the United States population. And research shows that, and this is research that I'm quoting from Dr. Robert Bullard, shows that 4 out of every 5 hazardous waste facilities are located in metropolitan areas. Next slide. So now I want to, well, I guess we've already, since I introduced Louisiana, I've been talking about, the dirty South. But now I want to center the rest of my comments on Georgia and Atlanta specifically. Next slide. So the South, and this is, I'm quoting Dr. Robert Bullard again, who is known very widely as the father of the environmental justice movement. He's an environmental sociologist, and by him being known as that, he gives lots of credence to the grassroots communities who are on the ground doing the work. But he is an esteemed environmental justice scholar. And so he says that the South has a legacy of unequal protection. And here you can sort of read into it that we're talking about, from slavery on. But, why would the environment be any different? And in fact, it isn't. Next slide. So we can, talk about the number of the different inequities that exist. And I hear people talk about, sort of the system and how the system is broken. But I really assert that the system isn't broken. It was built this way. These inequities were built into the system. Race and racialized politics were built into the systems that govern many of our cities in the United States. But definitely we see that in the city of Atlanta. Next slide. So here you see kind of the city of Atlanta's skyline on the left-hand side of the slide. And in 2009, Forbes magazine dubbed Atlanta as America's most toxic city. Next slide. We can argue about, Forbes' process for making that determination, but what they did say about the way that they came to this is that they looked at things like the number of Environmental Protection Agency responses in the principal city. They looked at the number of facilities releasing toxic chemicals. They looked at the pounds of toxic chemicals released, as well as our air quality ranking at that time. Next slide. Also, after that study came out, or that article, came out, in 2012, Travel and Leisure magazine, and we could, really argue about, how valid this survey was, but I just think it's interesting. They ranked Atlanta number 5 in a survey of the top 10 dirtiest cities, and this was a survey that was based on kind of the readership of that magazine. And people talked about Atlanta in a variety of ways. They talked about the litter. They talked about air pollution and even the taste of local tap water in terms of why Atlanta may have made that list in the top 5 spots. Next slide, please. Also in 2012, there was a study called The Patterns of Pollution, a report on demographics and pollution in metropolitan Atlanta. Next slide, please. This study was conducted by what was an environmental law organization called Green Law. In this study, they found 52 environmental justice hotspots in a 14-county metropolitan Atlanta area. So everything in red on this map are the hotspots, and then the blue boxes are cold spots. These are environmental justice cold spots. So the hotspots are places where you have multiple environmental pollution sources, but you also have that combined with social vulnerability. So low-income and communities of color, communities that have a number of a high percentage of language isolated households where folks over the age of 14 don't speak English fluently. And then these cold spots are places where you may have had multiple environmental hazards, but you didn't have the same levels of social vulnerability. You had communities that had more financial resources, more material resources to be able to fight against and to contend with the facilities that were in their communities. Next slide, please. As I kind of show you these various slides, and this is a slide that shows a map of Fulton County. Atlanta is primarily in Fulton County. It's also in a neighboring county called DeKalb County. But here I'm kind of focusing in on the Fulton County part of Atlanta. Here you see sort of circled, and without being able to see very well what all of these dots and boxes are, these are combined environmental stressors in Fulton County. And what you can quickly see without even being from Atlanta is that there are some places where there is a disproportionate shouldering of these different facilities and environmental stressors, versus other parts. And it's not that there aren't environmental stressors in other parts of the county, but obviously they're concentrated in certain parts. These certain parts include the city of Atlanta. They include part of South Fulton County. They include areas that are predominantly African American and that are lower income than some of the other areas where you see these environmental stressors exist. Next slide, please. So I say all that to say that place matters and that all places are not created equal. In fact, in Atlanta, life expectancy differs based on where you live. There was an article that came out in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution last year that pulled data from a recently released report from the National Center for Health Statistics and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that showed that there is an almost 25-year difference in life expectancy based on kind of the areas in Atlanta where you see the lowest life expectancy, the Bankhood neighborhood, which is a stone's throw away from the Georgia Tech campus, and people who live in the Vinings neighborhood, which is just a few miles away from the Bankhead neighborhood. An almost 25-year difference in life expectancy. Again, it's all about these systems that have been created this way. They've been created with inequities, and those inequities impact disproportionately communities of color, as well as low-income communities. And in many cases, these communities of color are low income, and experience a number of different stressors by design. Next slide, please. So to kind of bring it back to climate, if you look at those differences in life expectancy, what does that mean in the context of climate? So here are some of the, kind of top climate hazards that are predicted for Atlanta. So you see on the top bar, which is kind of the maybe darker bar, are kind of our current hazards. And then the brighter bar on the bottom is what we expect by the year 2050. So precipitation, warming, water deficit, drought, heat waves, in all of these categories, you're seeing the intensity of these hazards increase for the city of Atlanta. So what does that mean for residents on the west side of Atlanta who are already experiencing kind of the brunt of kind of the negative side of the social determinants of health? What about these communities that are already being impacted by various environmental hazards? What will it mean for these communities as the hazard intensity increases? Next slide, please. And I know I'm beginning to run short on time, so I want to just share a few last things about my work in the Proctor Creek watershed, specifically on the west side of Atlanta. This picture is actually a photo of Mableton from 2009, and I really just wanted to share this as we think about the intensity of these climate hazards increasing for the city of Atlanta. In this year of 2009, this is Mableton, which is a suburb of Atlanta. We also had huge impacts in terms of flooding within the city of Atlanta in places like the west side of Atlanta, where people lost their homes. They lost enormous parts of their yards. They lost their property. They had to completely get their homes sort of gutted and renovated because of the flooding that they experienced. And so this is something that not only impacted kind of lower income and communities of color, but really we saw some widespread impacts across the metropolitan Atlanta area. Next slide. So now I want to talk about the west side of Atlanta and the Proctor Creek watershed, which experiences its own challenges with things like flooding. And some of this is tied to infrastructure and the way that our infrastructure has not been properly invested in certain communities. But some of it is also tied to, behaviors of individuals who see communities like the Proctor Creek community and see it as a place, they see the disinvestment and think of it as a place that should be dumped on. And so people do a lot of illegal dumping from, whether we're talking about hazardous, illegally dumped scrap tires, or household trash and garbage, landfill sort of uncovered. We knew about one landfill in the Proctor Creek watershed, but then there was a mini or kind of baby landfill also identified through some investigating reporting of one of our news stations. And they, actually found and were able to tie back, records, of this unpermitted landfill back to, city agencies and others who, kind of swept this under the rug. And this is something that also is impacting this same community on the west side. Proctor Creek, locally has gotten a lot of attention lately because it has been elevated to a list of federal partnership sites for something called the Urban Waters Federal Partnership. And Proctor Creek was named to this list in 2013, in part due to the work of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance and community residents who kept elevating these issues and challenges in the watershed until the federal government began to pay attention and to make investments in the watershed to help us to make it cleaner, greener, healthier, and more sustainable. Proctor Creek used to be a source of pride for West Atlanta communities, a place where children played, where people fished, where people were baptized. And in fact, people still engage in some of these activities today, even though it's not as safe to do it. Proctor Creek is impacted by numerous pollution sources. E. coli specifically comes from our old, aging, combined sewer overflow infrastructure. It's also plagued by flooding. Next slide, please. And I think my next slide will show some flooding that people have experienced in their homes. We have a huge green infrastructure park being built right now in close proximity to the Georgia Tech campus called the Rodney Cook Senior Park. And that park is being built in part because there were over 70 or so homes. People, lost their homes. They were displaced from their homes because of huge flooding events that happened in the year 2002. And so now, understanding that this area is prone for flooding, people have been relocated away from this, and a green infrastructure solution is being implemented in that area. These solutions, are good in terms of addressing the environmental hazards, but they can also sometimes bring their own sets of challenges, like things like green gentrification. Next slide. So here, I want to just, kind of talk just very briefly about the work that I'm doing with Proctor Creek residents. We are engaged in a lot of community science work, collaboration on addressing environmental hazards and challenges, and research questions that are of importance to the community. Rebecca Watts-Hull talked earlier about citizen science. She mentioned the group I See Change out of New Orleans that is doing amazing work in this vein as well. And so we are, focusing on ways that we can elevate this local community knowledge about climate hazards and risk, about environmental health hazards and risk, and about the conditions in these communities that are impacting people and creating the inequities that we see and experience on the landscape on an everyday basis. There is so much power, I think, in these residents, not only in the Proctor Creek watershed, but in other places, collecting their own data, making their own compelling cases for social and policy change, and holding elected officials and government officials at every level, from the local to the federal levels, accountable for making sound investments in these communities, for ending kind of the drought of investments, or I should say the droughts that has been associated with the divestment of public resources in these communities, but at the same time really centering the community around these solutions so that communities can help diagnose the problems. They can also help to implement the solutions, and so that communities are not a victim of their own success. Like, as new money, as investments, as new developments are made in places like the Proctor Creek watershed, we don't want the same communities that are advocating for these changes pushed out through forces like gentrification and displacement. So it's really important that communities are at the table, that they are a part of the decision making, they are part of our research and practice on the ground to help us to achieve more resilient communities. And I really love what Jalonne White-Newsome said in terms of, or Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome said in terms of making the systems more resilient so that the people don't have to be. Right now, the people are shouldering so much of this work. Next slide, please. So I want to end with my last kind of 2 or 3 slides as we are getting to the end of my time. I talked just briefly about some of the work happening on the ground in Atlanta with Proctor Creek residents and their work in community science, in their work to push for more effective and more authentic community engagement processes that center their knowledge, that center their lived experience, in solutions that are being implemented to address a myriad of challenges that our communities face. But I can't leave you today without also talking just briefly about the role that women are playing in this work for climate justice and for environmental justice, whether we're talking about here in Atlanta, we're talking about in the United States, or around the world. I'm going to focus in on a few women that are in the United States, but what I really want to kind of assert here is that there have been countless social movements that have been sustained by nameless, faceless women who have received little or no recognition for their contributions, for their behind-the-scenes leadership, or for their sustaining forces in causing the dust of change to rise. Again, whether we're talking about locally or globally. We can look to global figures like Dr. Wangari Maathai and her work with the Greenbelt movement, which is so inspirational. The work that she did with women in Kenya, helping them to, figure out ways to make income and to plant trees and to really, introduce sort of a green revolution to that country. Next slide. We also have a lot of powerful women, here locally in the United States. And I've spent the last several years looking into, who these women are and what their stories are and how they are coming to this work. If we go to the next slide, I just kind of have a couple of collages or montages of women. Some of these women are deceased. In the middle photograph, sort of in the coral colored shirt or coral, or I don't know if it's red or what have you, is Hazel Johnson, who we know as the mother of environmental justice. She was from Chicago, Illinois, and started a group called People for Community Recovery. Her daughter, Cheryl Johnson, has picked up that work since the passing of Miss Hazel. There are other leaders who are no longer with us on this slide. Margaret Williams from Pensacola, Florida, and I think Jalonne talked earlier about work in Escambia County, Florida. This woman was so powerful and worked to try to get her community relocated away from a number of toxic facilities. Below Miss Margaret is Miss Connie Tucker, who was a powerhouse in the Atlanta area, now deceased, but was the executive director of the Southern Organizing Committee for Economic and Social Justice in the Atlanta office, and one who really impacted me as I was a Spelman student getting engaged in this work. Also on this slide, Dr. Mildred McLean from Savannah, Georgia, who has worked for a number of years to protect and educate communities of color in Savannah, Georgia. They're battling, pollution from the shipping ports and channels in Savannah. And she really pioneered something called ACANET, academic institutions, communities and agencies. We kind of call some of this work community-based participatory research now, or action research. But Dr. McLean in Savannah really pioneered this work in these collaborative partnerships to bring together academic institutions, government agencies, nonprofits, and communities together to do amazing work. Next slide, please. In this next slide, I just wanted to point out again a number of powerhouses here, from Dr. Fatima Shafi, who is a colleague at Spelman College and an environmental justice scholar. Margie Richard, who is from Norco, Louisiana, who got her community relocated away from a shell oil refinery. And she and her community were engaged in a lot of community science work with an organization called the Bucket Brigade. Monica Lewis Patrick, who is with We the People of Detroit, who is fighting in Detroit, Michigan today, and linking those water shutoffs to a wide range of health issues and issues around justice. I'll stop there because I can go on and on talking about these amazing women and how they have presented solutions in their communities. I didn't get a chance to address all of them and what they do and who they are. But if you just begin to look up some of the names that I've mentioned, you'll see some of their amazing stories in terms of the work that they are doing on a day-to-day basis to start these dusts of change to rise in our communities to fight for environmental and climate justice. I think this last slide, or the next slide, includes my contact information. If we could transition to that. And then the very last slide, if we can transition to the next, to the last one, I just want to leave us with this thought: environmental justice now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that talk. It looks like we have a few minutes for questions. Let me go into the Q&A and let's see. We have a question from Drake, and she asks, how much climate activism is focused on reforming, repairing areas that are affected by heavy polluters versus moving people living in these areas to places without these contaminations inequities?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I can fully answer that from a from a global perspective or even the perspective of the United States, I think there's both. Both is definitely happening. There is work to try to, kind of reform those polluters, to press them to do the right thing. There are fights happening, to get communities relocated away from these toxic facilities. The challenge with a lot of that work that's going on that I didn't get a chance to, and I had it in my notes here, but just didn't mention it, is really the rollback in the United States that we're seeing right now with respect to a number of environmental regulations, attacks on policies like the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is a federal policy, and there are proposals to change NEPA to weaken it, quite honestly. And if things like that happen, that will severely impact the ability of communities to be able to fight sort of in place to better hold facilities accountable, and to hold the government accountable also for enforcement that is just and equitable in terms of the outcomes that we see from those permitting and regulation activities. So I'll end by just saying that both is happening, but there are challenges to both in terms of our current political and environmental context and climate.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today and answer that question. Please do keep asking questions in the chat, Nataki, if you have the opportunity to go in and answer any of those. We'd all greatly appreciate it. Now we will briefly showcase 5 student voices from the field of environmental and climate justice for our lightning talk segment. Our first lightning talk will be given by Angelica Acevedo. Angelica is an undergraduate student at Georgia Tech studying literature, media, and communication with a pre-law minor, and will be highlighting the importance of equity in green building design.
Hi everyone, my name is Angelica Acevedo, and I am a 4th year technical communications student at Georgia Tech. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you today about the importance of environmental and climate justice. This concept requires an intersection between sustainability and equity. Equity being different from equality, as it recognizes that all groups need to be treated fairly, although this treatment can manifest differently throughout these groups, because some have pre-existing advantages and resources that others do not. So now that you've gotten a clear sense of what equity is, why do we need it to achieve sustainability? Why is it so important? I think that the NAACP's Going Beyond Green report actually answers this question really beautifully. They say sustainability without equity sustains inequities. As students of the change-making generation, it is our responsibility to bring awareness to this very idea. The effects of climate change negatively impact developing communities at a much higher rate than developed ones. Ironically, developing communities contribute to environmental degradation the least, yet they're experiencing extreme weather events, flooding, drought, pollution, and some peoples have even been forced to migrate from their homes. This is not equitable, nor is it just. We need to begin fighting for environmental justice by tackling these patterns head on. Although it can be hard to digest and hard to hear, we need to bring these discussions to the table. These perspectives can no longer afford to be ignored, and we need to value the voices most affected by climate change. We need to begin to use structures like the Candida building as guides for our future. As the most sustainable building in the Southeast, it employed local laborers in its construction and seeks to engage students from all different majors and all different backgrounds. It seeks to positively engage its local community while simultaneously being net energy positive. That's 2 positives. 2 positives that we should seek to achieve. Structures like these should be what we're working towards, and this is ultimately how we're going to be able to sustain humanity and future generations. The state of the climate is frankly horrific, and we will not be able to ameliorate our current situation without considering equity in our green policies, our green construction, our green education, but most importantly, in our everyday mindset. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Summer 2020 Sustainable Cities Studio, a team of Georgia Tech students
Yeah,
who produce.
we're going to kill that project. It's going to be our project.
Next, we will hear from Summer 2020 Sustainable Cities Studio, a team of Georgia Tech students who produced a climate vulnerability assessment of the city of Savannah as part of their Sustainable Cities minor.
This summer was the second ever Sustainable Cities Studio course in the Georgia Tech School of City and Regional Planning. As an interdisciplinary team of undergraduate students, we worked completely remotely to create a climate vulnerability assessment for the City of Savannah's Office of Sustainability. At the core of this project are the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which we integrated through the analyses and recommendations. The climate vulnerability assessment followed the framework from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In their assessment report number 5, the IPCC defines climate vulnerabilities at the intersection among social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. We are very lucky to have the opportunity to collaborate with several academic and community partners, including Georgia Tech's Serve, Learn, Sustain initiative, Dr. Kim Cobb, Dr. Matt Cox and Greenlink Analytics, Dr. Mildred McLean, Harambe House and Partners, Michael McMiller and the Partnership for Southern Equity, and Nick Deathley in the City of Savannah. The project was divided up into teams based on the 3 pillars of sustainability: environment, economics, and social equity.
The environmental team analyzed the vulnerabilities of rising sea levels, urban heat island effect, as well as air and groundwater pollution. Our most notable finding determined that poorer areas of the city are more drastically affected by rising sea levels. This ties in with our emphasis on SDG 10, reduced inequalities, as this comparison highlights a severe inequality within the limits of Savannah.
The Econ team focused their spatial analysis on small businesses' vulnerabilities, such as their flooding risk and insurance need, which relates to SDGs 8, 11, and 13. We found that businesses experience varying degrees of flooding risk, depending on location, and the measures we recommended were a combination of community-led initiatives to both inform and mitigate flood damages in areas of higher risk.
The social equity team identified several social injustice issues in Savannah. From our research, some of the most relevant include food insecurity, crime, unequal and segregated education, and a lack of affordable housing. Our analysis revealed that the Black community in downtown Savannah suffers from the highest rates of housing burden and unemployment in an area that is prone to groundwater pollution. Financial stressors and poor living conditions can result in environmental challenges affecting these communities more severely.
Our GIS mapping tool and recommendations can be used by the City of Savannah to identify at-risk neighborhoods and work towards a more equitable and sustainable future for the city. Thank you for watching. Check out our website for more information at tinyurl.com/cpcapstone2020.
Emory University undergraduate Ariella Farchi-Beher presents the next talk. She is studying business with a concentration in sustainability management. Ariella will be discussing climate change and migration in Guatemala.
Hello, my name is Ariella Farchi, and today I'm going to talk to you about how there is a current migration crisis in Guatemala that is a direct result of climate change. Guatemala is a very small country, but very beautiful country at the head of Central America. It has a population of 17 million people, 59.3% of which are living in poverty, and an additional 23% of which are living in extreme poverty, which is considered living on or under $1 a day. Additionally, the country has a GDP of $85.3 billion, 20% of which is attributed to agriculture. Guatemala is a country that's very blessed with incredibly rich biodiversity and beautiful natural resources. Along with many other Latin American countries, Guatemala is a pioneer when it comes to environmental protection laws and granting rights to their resources. Guatemala is also a country with a developing economy and lots of poverty. And sadly, the way that these two issues combine is that often Guatemala's well-established environmental laws are overlooked in the benefit of economic development. This plays a crucial role in how Guatemala fails to mitigate the effects of climate change, especially when it comes to the agricultural development industry. And this causes what I like to call a not so positive feedback loop. As deforestation advances and workers hack into forests to make room for new farmland, carbon sequestration in Guatemala diminishes. The forests and jungles of Guatemala are hugely important carbon sinks, and they capture emissions created from industries all over the country. When these trees are cut down, the CO2 they were storing is released back into the atmosphere and the sinks disappear. Once the carbon is released back into the atmosphere, it contributes to the greenhouse effect and begins affecting different climate patterns on a global scale. For Guatemala, the biggest threat climate change poses is fluctuating precipitation patterns. In most Guatemalan farmlands, these changes mean very long droughts followed by either delayed periods of little rain or very destructive heavy storms. Since many farmers depend on rain as a natural co-irrigation system, these droughts significantly affect each season's growth. As a result of decreased precipitation, crop yields all over the country, especially for coffee beans, sugarcane, and corn, have been falling since the late 90s. This significant dip in agriculture is reflected in the country's GDP. As a result, Guatemalan leaders scrambled to find a solution to this pressing problem. And as they ponder if they should repurpose protected greenlands in order to be able to continue stimulating the agricultural economy, the loop starts all over again and the issue is back to square one. From a humanitarian aspect, this lack of adequate mitigation results in a migration crisis. For day laborers and sustenance growers alike who rely on land to feed their families, job, salary, and food insecurity seems to rise with no end in sight. For thousands of Guatemalans living in extreme poverty, migration to the United States seems to be the only option. They leave all they have ever known behind and head north in the search of a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariella. Next, we hear from Alex Ip, a Georgia Tech undergraduate studying environmental engineering. Alex will discuss the role storytelling plays in discussing issues of environmental and climate justice.
Hello, this is Alex, and I'll take 3 minutes to talk about climate storytelling. Let's get started. I was born in the year 2000. We've got the climate science for 3 decades. The deficit model, the assumption that more good science in education will change people's minds, it's not working. Climate change is an issue that triggers our emotions. These are human emotions and everyone has them, regardless of who you are, what you believe in, or where you are. We fear when we experience the upheaval of our social fabric and when our worldview gets challenged. We get exhausted by the world. It's easy to become numb by what we don't see or feel and listen. We get thrown into despair when we become overwhelmed by such deep systemic issues just like racism, classism, and sexism. Storytelling provides one way to break the paradigm. A person can argue about statistics, but they cannot deny one's lived experience. Stories allow us to build bridges, be vulnerable, and buy trust to solve environmental and climate injustices. I was fortunate to have interned under Dr. Nataki Osman-Jelks of Wawa, today's keynote speaker this summer. We were to share Wawa's narrative on how we are fighting for the residents living in the majority Black and working class neighborhoods in Westside Atlanta. You might remember that Georgia Tech had a broken pipe in the summer. Did you know that Atlanta's sewage system has been in place for nearly a century, and it was built not to serve Black residents? Did you know in order to avoid racial integration, our city filled up a stormwater draining lake in Grand Park and turned it to a parking lot for Sue Atlanta? These anecdotes and community knowledge were central to an online interactive story maps I made using ArcGIS software for Georgia Tech's summer classes. As the founder and editor of The Asylum, a media outlet creating personal stories of science and humanity, I have been working with science professionals all across the country to understand why they care about climate change. For some, it was seeing the community skiing place being shut down for good due to rising temperatures. For another, it was being slighted by their professor because of their South Carolinian upbringing. All of us in the climate action sphere should know that we're not saviors. But by being authentic and willing to work with and listen to the people who need to hear the message, we can work together to address these problems. I highly recommend you to check out the stories I just mentioned. I'd love to have you involved in our work. Can I count on you to tell your climate story? Thank you and enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Thank you, Alex. We conclude today's lightning talks by a talk by Eof Fleming and Jiahu Plomp. Eof and Jiahu are graduate students at Leiden University in the Netherlands, pursuing their LLM in financial law, where they have organized a lecture series showing the inherent connection between law, justice, and sustainability.
Hello, Atlanta. My name is Eva Fleming, and I'm a law student at Leiden University and also UN Youth Representative on Sustainable Development for the Netherlands. And this is my colleague Jawi Plum, also a law student at Leiden University. Together, we have organized a lecture series on sustainability and law and a summer course on international law and climate change. We organized the lecture series on sustainability and law because we believe that the question of sustainability is inextricably linked with the way we organize our legal systems. So for this lecture series, we invited professors and practitioners from different legal fields to teach about a current sustainability topic in their field. For example, we had lectures on the climate change agenda, the EU single plastics regulation, and the carbon emissions tax. This way, we hope to show all students, whether they have a financial or administrative legal background, that sustainability will be a topic they will need to think about in their future legal careers. And we are happy to say that next month our second edition will be starting.
My name is Jalonne Plomp, and I'm also a law student at Leiden University. And together with Eva, we organized a summer course on international law and climate change this summer. One of the reasons why we did this was, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has to be online. And we wanted to show our fellow students the impact of vulnerable groups in the international community, such as small island developing states. And besides that, we wanted to show them that the consequences of climate change are inherently connected to climate justice. And at last, we want to wish you the best of luck with the Global Climate Action Symposium.
Thank you to all of the students for sharing their work and voices. This brings us to the end of today's general events and marks the beginning of today's virtual tour and exhibit. We encourage you to use the links in your agenda, general email, or the event chat to join either a virtual tour of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance or a photography exhibit by Barbara Dabrowski, along with the opportunity to observe a writing workshop, Where to Land After the Pandemic, led by Sohail Harimbaba beginning at noon. Again, links for all of these are available online in your agenda and will be shared in the event chat. Shortcut links are also displayed on this slide. These experiences will be fully recorded and archived on your virtual event dashboard on Eventbrite. If you have not already registered for the event, we encourage you to do so by going to globalchange.gatech.edu/GCAS. Registering does provide you with a record of the event. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the virtual tour or art exhibit in just a few moments.